What I'm proposing in this book, in a way, flies in the face of common sense. Anyone who reads Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John sees immediately that the story really holds together very well. It could easily, very easily, be made into a passion play, as it has so often been done. Despite the differences, the story holds together. And you have 4 accounts. Leave out the Gospel of Peter for the moment. So what's your problem? Here, surely, at least, we have the story hour by hour, blow by blow, word by word. To suggest anything else seems weird. What I'm suggesting is precisely something else. Namely, the 2 terms I use are history remembered, which would mean that basically the followers of Jesus found out remarkably early, very soon after the death of Jesus, exactly what had happened, none of which is impossible, of course. And this is the story handed down to us. What I'm suggesting is something quite different. Well, it's not really different at all. It's really exactly what everyone else says. It's not of any celestial interludes too early in the morning. These are the big questions. Remember this story. Nobody else seems to know the details of this story. Now, I'm not talking about the brute facts that Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, that Jesus was crucified with some conjunction probably of Jewish authority and Roman authority in some relationship to the Paschal feast. That I would probably take as historically quite sure. You have it in general in Tacitus, you have it in general in Josephus. There was a movement. The founder was killed, but the movement continued. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the details. The who spat in Jesus' face, the what did the high priest say, what did Jesus say, what did Pilate say. That's what I'm talking about. Nobody mentions any of those details anywhere outside that stream of tradition in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now that's an argument from silence, of course. But hear it. If, for example, even in a throwaway line, Paul had said, when he was talking, say, about suffering or something, they even spat in the face of Jesus, then I would say, oops, Paul knows the story. You can't find it anywhere. Not even into, say, Ignatius of Antioch, who's insisting on the reality of the crucifixion and the reality of Jesus' life, mentions any of these details. Nobody mentions the details except the gospel writers. Now you could say, well, fine, but they do. So the second major problem is how many independent sources do we have in these writings? Now that becomes crucial. Mark is used by Matthew and Luke, and even a very conservative scholar like Ray Brown, I do not use conservative pejoratively, by the way, would insist that Mark is the only consecutive source used by Matthew and Luke. And it's highly debated at the moment whether John is an independent source. I do not think John in the Passion narrative is an independent source. So all of a sudden, that stream of tradition becomes not a fourfold witness, as it were, but Mark into Matthew and Luke into John. And I'm not even mentioning the Gospel of Peter for the moment. So now, wait a minute. Everything, in a way, seems to depend on Mark. Now, if this was established right from the very beginning and passed on, all of which is quite possible, why does nobody else seem to know about it? When Matthew and Luke are literally copying Mark, how come they don't know another version? If it's been passed on for 50 years by then. The final objection is this. When you focus down on the elements, by an element I mean, say, the garments of Jesus being divided, or spitting in the face of Jesus, or the gall and vinegar drink, or something like that. All of those details, you hear echoes behind them of the Old Testament texts from the Psalms or the prophets. Secondly, the wider complexes. By a wider complex I mean such as Jesus going up the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane scene, or, for example, the trial scene. Behind not only the little elements, but behind the larger complexes, you see, for example, the story of David having been betrayed by Ahithophel, climbing the Mount of Olives in 2 Samuel, Jesus betrayed by Judas, climbing the Mount of Olives in Mark. So the wider complexes seem to be modeled on Old Testament texts as well. And finally, the overall story of the just one who is vindicated, the righteous sufferer who is vindicated by God. That seems to be the overall arching model for it. So everywhere I look, I see the Old Testament. Now, that raises finally a new hypothesis. What if basically the first followers of Jesus knew almost nothing about what had happened and were not interested in going around to see if they could find out what happened, but were very, very interested in finding out, was this all in the hands of God? Was the crucifixion of Jesus a sign that God had abandoned Jesus? And was the fear not that the Romans might come after them, but God might come after them? So where else could you go to find out if this was all in the hands of God except into your tradition? And of course you know what you're looking for. You're looking for anything in your tradition that says, yes, the righteous suffer. And of course you don't have to look very far in the Christian Old Testament to find out that that's almost like a job description of the righteous. The righteous suffer, and they are still the righteous. So that is basically my argument, that behind this narrative that we have is layers of Old Testament texts which at a certain point, and that we'll have to come into in more detail later, is put into a narrative story. It was not there from the beginning. So that literally, when Paul says in the 50s that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures and rose on the third day according to the Scriptures, he's not thinking of a story, but he's thinking of a lot of Scriptures. So that basically is the overall thesis.